So I'm Rachel Whirling. I'm the coordinator for the Land Steward program. And if you would like to hear about upcoming classes, you can go to our homepage and just find that little subscribe button and click that and sign up for our e-news, or not our e-news, but our upcoming events list. And you'll just hear about classes that are coming up. That's the only thing that comes out over that mail serve. Tonight we have with us Rebecca Baylog, and she's a volunteer who's helping us in case we have any technological issues, like if I would get kind of booted out from the Zoom or anything, then Rebecca would just take the reins. If you have any ideas about upcoming classes, things you'd like to hear about, just drop those into the chat and I'll try to capture that. We like to gather ideas from our audience. That's really how we get our ideas for presenters and topics. Okay, and if you go to our homepage again, you can see what's coming up for us. We have, oops, let's see, I'm working on one screen, so things are a little reduced here for me, but on May 20th, so just next week, we have Backyard Agroforestry, Sustainable Food Production in a Changing Climate, and that's part of our Sustainable Living series, which I'll talk more about in a moment. And then on June 5th and 8th, we have kind of a paired program. You don't have to attend one to attend the other, but it's about cultivating lavender with Jared Brzeski. I'm sure I'm butchering his last name, but he's a really excellent instructor, knows so much about lavender. He's a lavender whisperer is what I would really say about him. So there's an online Zoom presentation on the 5th, and then on the 8th, there's a more limited attendance, but a tour of his farm, which is out, I believe it's in Williams. All right, so I mentioned the Sustainable Living series. So this is a series of classes that are themed. So we have, I coordinate the Land Steward program, and the focus of that is on rural living. So it kind of is around topics that assume that you have rural land that you're taking care of. And we really wanted to get some sustainable topics kind of threaded together for people anywhere. Maybe you don't own land, maybe you're renting a place in town, but there are still lots of topics that might have to do with people. So we've partnered with the Master Gardeners and our wonderful Jackson Soil and Water Conservation District, and we've created a series of classes, and then we also have this plan, My Sustainable Living personal action plan that you can go. So we have our instructors give some suggestions about things that you can do. So this is kind of modeled on what we do with the Land Steward program, but kind of simpler. But if you go attend any of those classes, you'll get that link and you can work through and find the recordings to those classes and maybe find some action items to help us make a more sustainable world together. So now we are on to tonight's presentation, which is Native and Non-Native Insect Pests of Forest Trees, Diagnosis and Management. And this, of course, really threads together with lots of things that are going on, drought and all that. I'm eager to hear what Christine has to say. Christine Buhl is a graduate of Oregon State University and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has served as an entomologist from Hawaii to the country of Lebanon on projects from public health to chemical ecology. She currently serves as the state forest entomologist with the Oregon Department of Forestry, where she provides statewide technical assistance to public and private landowners, and she monitors forest health via aerial and ground surveys. So I will stop my share and let Christine get her presentation up. And if you have any questions as we're going on, we'll answer the questions at the end. Just put them in the chat. Okay, I will turn my video off and turn it over to Christine. Let us know in the audience. Let us know if you how the sound is. We were having some issues before, so we want to kind of do a little bit of a sound check.
Testing for the audience. Test. Good. Okay. Wonderful.
Sounds good.
Wonderful.
Right.
Well, thank you so much for having me present. The more we can get this information out about awareness of forest health, some of the precursors that might set forests up for potential damage, what insects actually are pests versus ones that are not, is really helpful because it helps prepare you for what you're seeing on the landscape, what you report back to us as a problem versus not a problem, and maybe just a general awareness of the state of things as they are now and what we hope to see going forward with some improved management. So with that, I am discussing primarily forest insect pests. However, I do always like to start with insects as beneficials. So I do want to note that the vast majority of insects that we see on our landscape, doesn't matter what the landscape is, but especially in forests, are actually beneficial. They're working in the background for us. They're doing a lot of things that we either don't recognize or we're not paying attention to until we start to notice that maybe we are having increased pest issues. And that could possibly be because these natural enemies that are working in the background to help suppress some of the pest insects or keep those numbers at a manageable level, those might be depressed. And so then we recognize that we have all of these things working in the background for us. So I do want us to take a moment to recognize that insects are a part of every ecosystem. They're the base of many food chains, including for humans. They're natural enemy pest control, both as predators and parasitoids. They serve an essential purpose for decomposition and nutrient cycling. I always like to say we would have a buildup of roadkill if we didn't have these natural enemies working in the background, breaking down animal tissues and plant tissues. And it's particularly important in the forested system where we do still need to break down wood and dead trees over time. And it does take a long time for these things to break down. And insects are part of that process. Oftentimes, they're one of the starting points of that process of breaking down mechanically that material. And there are some insects, such as termites, that are essential for breaking down this material because they're one of the few creatures that can actually digest wood material. And that's really hard to break down. It's not a great nutritious food source. And so not a lot of things eat it, and a lot of things that eat it can actually digest it really well. And we do need those nutrients to be put back in the system. So they're doing that for us actively. This is more controversial, but these insects also provide selective removal for less vigorous trees. Now, I know we don't want to see any trees die on our landscape, but a dead tree is still beneficial on our landscape. It's still providing trapped carbon, wildlife habitat. And so having some of these trees in the landscape reduced in a way that they are not out competing some of our healthier trees. So insects that are selectively going after the really stressed trees that just are less vigorous, that's actually beneficial because it makes more room for the really vigorous trees that we want on our landscape. And lastly, insects do provide a variety of different services, including services such as jobs like pollination and tangible products such as silk and shellac and dyes, honey, and beeswax. So insects are beneficial. They're a part of every system. We want them to be there. It's typically when insects tend to grow to an unnatural population level that they can become pests. And I'll get into those scenarios. But one more note about insects is they are diverse. And because of this diversity, they can fit into all these different niches that they can serve lots of different purposes in a lot of different places. They have a really small body size. They have a chitinous shell or this hard shell that helps retain moisture, but also protects them from predators. Some of them have very quick and prolific generation. So being able to mass produce or produce very quickly is a great benefit for some systems. And for them, they are adapted to many environments. As I mentioned, they could be specialists or generalists that can eat a lot of things or just a few things. And probably most interestingly, they have a wide array of ways of communicating. And one of these is really important. It's part of their olfactory communication that helps them to determine what tree they want to attack or how to find a mate, for example. And we utilize this for our own benefit, and I'll get into that. So one more plug for insects and how neat they are. A lot of diversity there. Some of these insects have really wild body shapes and forms. Even within a specific order, they have a lot of different diversity. So this right here, what you're seeing is just moth and butterfly caterpillars. So just the larval stage of all these different species have such a wide diversity. And sometimes we like to mimic some of those punk rock hairdos that some of those caterpillars have. So really diverse. They take a huge slice of the species pie. So all the blue slices you see here are invertebrates. Most of them are insects. And compare that to the yellow slice, which includes all species of human, mammals, birds, fish, reptiles. We are outcompeted by insects. So they're here and they're here to stay. But I do want to make clear that many of the insects that we see on our landscape are beneficial. The ones that I'm going to talk about today, it's a small handful of the insects that are out there that can actually become pests. And most of these insects are native that I'm going to talk about today, and I will highlight the ones that are exotic and invasive. But then most of those insects are secondary, meaning they are going after trees that are already stressed. They're maybe already on their way out, and these insects are just finishing them off. And so I often get phone calls that people are panicked and they ask, what can I spray to kill these insects that are killing my trees? And I have to have them back up for a minute and recognize that most often these insects are only pests under some scenarios, that if you have a healthy landscape, a healthy system where you have a native tree and a native insect, they have co-evolved together and they usually reach some sort of equilibrium. And it's just when that's disrupted, that you have a whole bunch of stressed trees, for example, that those native insects can then explode in their populations, taking advantage of that resource and then spilling out in a large number into maybe less stressed trees, because they can just overwhelm them with sheer number. And then also we have non-native insects that didn't co-evolve with our trees, and our trees aren't as defended. So there are some scenarios in which these insects can become pests. So I'll go through some of the major ones that we typically see on our landscape. So the first one I've already mentioned. When we have a bunch of stressed trees on the landscape, we are seeing this more and more with widespread drought year after year. So that's a really big one. In fact, the picture that you're seeing there is mountain pine beetle that took out primarily lodgepole and some ponderosa pine that was overstocked. So really outcompeting each other for moisture in a long droughted landscape. And these beetles can sense that those trees are stressed. They give off ethanol, which is an attractive smell to them. When these trees are stressed, they release that attractive smell. The beetles come in, they build up their populations in those trees, and they're able to overcome those trees' defenses because their sheer number that has built up. Another landscape level problem that can predispose trees to pests are catastrophic wildfire that damages a lot of trees. However, some trees are still living, and so there's still food for those insects that are coming in that want a living tree, that they finish them off. When we have large amounts of storm damage or even mechanical damage, let's say we have an operator that's kind of doing a sloppy job and there's a lot of root compaction, a lot of trees get rubbed up with equipment and kind of cutting some of those tissues. These insects can smell that these trees have been damaged, they're stressed, and then they will come in large numbers. So that is the most common scenario in which we see pests build up and become an issue that can damage or kill trees. Another one are just cyclical outbreaks. And so with these cyclical outbreaks, typically they are biologically predetermined. So for example, maybe a defoliating species such as a species of moth, they're caterpillars that are feeding on the leaves. They might have an outbreak every 5 to 10 years. And it's kind of periodic that it just, what goes up then must come down. And so it's kind of a predetermined outbreak cycle, and they'll have an increase in their population, but then typically it naturally collapses due to overcrowding, a lack of food, diseases that start getting spread when they're overpopulated. So typically we do not employ a lot of control methods in these scenarios because it is kind of a natural cycle that it goes up and then it collapses. And this example is in Central Oregon. This is Pandora moth that every so often they will emerge in large number. And this is a native insect. The caterpillars eat pine needles. They eat it pretty extensively. It's a really large insect. And so this is really common to see every so often, but these populations eventually do collapse. The last scenario is a lack of natural controls. And so when we have, for example, invasive species on the landscape, so our native trees are here, and then we have an insect that our trees are not used to. Our trees do not co-evolve with them, so they cannot resist or tolerate them. They don't have the defenses to combat that insect. And sometimes that insect can then damage or kill the tree more so than the natives. And so invasive species are a big problem. I will discuss emerald ash borer and Mediterranean oak borer, which are recent detections in Oregon. Additionally, other natural controls that are depressed, such as natural enemies due to pesticides, maybe a pesticide drift or a general broad spectrum pesticide that's repeatedly used, it depresses all these beneficial insects in the background that can help reduce populations of our pest insects. Additionally, if we have mild winters and we're having more and more mild winters, just more insects make it through the winter. And especially if it's an insect that's exotic, that's not used to our winters and maybe prefers a warmer winter, this is really beneficial that they can actually make it through the winter. And that can be damaging for our trees if they're pests. So the really common forest stressors that we always need to keep in mind is when you are planting trees, you want to plant the right tree in the right place. So what tree species or cultivar, or even the origin of the tree, the provenance, where that seed grew up and the conditions that they are adapted to, is that being then planted in the correct place? And in the correct place, what relative to our changing climate, because that is shifting as well. What's the site type like? Is the soil type suitable for retaining enough moisture? What is the aspect or the slope? Are these trees really exposed to sunlight? Were they not established well? Any sort of drought, often in combination with high temperatures, that increases moisture stress, and that stresses the trees, leaving them predisposed to insects. And competition, kind of the same thing. Trees are out competing each other, or understory weeds are out competing trees for enough moisture. And moisture is really essential because that helps trees create sap, and additional sap that is utilized for a defense. It's a mechanical and chemical barrier against insects. So sap is highly important, and for that, trees need moisture. There are various other things that stress trees on the landscape. Years go by that trees are on the landscape. They're long-lived species, and so they're exposed to stress after stress every year, and they're quite durable. However, in recent years, they've been really pushed to the limit, especially by drought. And then all these other factors can come into play every year. And so it's important to be mindful of, don't be that person that says the insects are killing my trees, I need to spray the insects. Think before the insects, what brought the insects to the site? Because a stress tree is a susceptible tree. And the more that you can do to make your trees healthy, the more tolerance they'll have or resistance they'll have against those insects. So it's really important to really target what is the primary stressor here, address that. And if you're addressing tree health and always trying to make your trees as healthy as possible, they can defend themselves. Following are some best management practices that are addressing all the points on the previous slide about how do you select the correct species for your site, especially incorporating climate change. So there are some really useful tools there if you are planting trees, trying to decide what trees should you plant beyond just what species to plant. So really pay attention to how you are establishing those trees, giving them the best start that you can. A couple of other plugs I'll just mention for making your trees as healthy as possible. Don't do things like fertilize. When trees are already stressed for moisture in these drought times, fertilizing just increases their growth, increases their water needs. It's not going to help them against insects, especially if they're already droughted. So that's something that maybe you're not thinking of, that we often use fertilizer in the urban landscape, but in some landscapes where trees are not getting enough moisture or not getting supplemental moisture, such as irrigation, fertilization is not necessarily the best idea. I do also just want to highlight for your reference later that we do have a fact sheet to help guide landowners that have dealt with wildfire damage to determine how much wildfire damage is actually going to kill the tree. And you might want to remove that tree from your landscape, or just be aware that it might die a couple years after the wildfire, or it might be infested by insects because it's now been weakened by wildfire. So we do have a handy guide there. And basically what it does is it's a chart that helps you determine, based on the tree species and the size class, how much damage to the crown, how much damage to the cambium, looking at that Buhl chart, can that tree withstand before it will succumb to that fire damage or be predisposed to insects. So that's kind of a handy resource to have in your back pocket. One more thing I'll say about, before we jump into insects, about setting the stage. I just want to show you an example of exactly what we're seeing on the landscape in terms of how drought is kind of setting up trees to not be as susceptible, or to be more susceptible to the insects on our landscape, natives and non-natives, because these trees are just entirely too stressed. And so we've been having some ongoing drought conditions. And this is just an example from the water year 2021 to 2022. So it's just a period of time. It's 1 year period of time that we compare relative to the 30-year average. What's the moisture condition looking like? And so basically all you need to know here is red is bad. Red means more droughted. The darker the red, the higher the level of drought. And so the map on the left is the beginning of the water year in September 2021. Things got a bit better as you move throughout the year and look to the map to your right, but you can see that there's still quite a bit of red, and look at where that red is concentrated. First, it started in Southwest Oregon on through the east side of the Cascades into Northeast Oregon, And then in the second map, it's still pretty dry in southwest Oregon, that it's still orange, and then red in the middle of the state in central Oregon, just east of the Cascades. And then that subsequent year, we flew aerial survey, and we do this every year. It's a over 7-year data set to map how much damage we're seeing in the forested landscape and determine what is it coming from. And what we saw is a high concentration of tree mortality and damage right along in the same areas that had experienced extreme drought stress. We get on the ground there, we take core samples, we can see reduced growth that aligns with the years of drought. That kind of correlates with the trees are really stressed, they're not growing well. And if they aren't growing very well, they don't have enough resources for defenses. That leaves them susceptible to insects. And so we've had a little bit of rain here recently. It feels a little bit better. But I don't want you to kid yourself. We still have large portions of the state that still have a little bit of drought stress, even with as much rain as we've been getting. Now, the conditions are looking pretty good right now. However, we're just now heading into summer. It's just around the corner, and things are going to get pretty dry again. So I do encourage you to sign up for this monthly drought email. It helps you keep a pulse on where things are at currently in terms of temperature and precipitation levels relative to the 30-year average. And there are also predictions going forward for the next few weeks. What are those conditions going to look like? And keep in mind, drought is not just about levels of temperature and precipitation. So it's not necessarily how hot it got one day. It's the timing, the duration, the frequency, and the rate of change of not having enough precipitation, or that period lasting a really long time, or maybe it's taking place early in the growing season of the tree when they most need that moisture. So pay attention to the different ways that drought is impacting the trees. And the way that drought impacts trees is it kills fine roots, it kills the vascular tissues in the tree, so the tree can no longer obtain moisture and suck it up through the roots and translocate it throughout the tree. And year after year, when trees are getting drought stress, these tissues, they get damaged, and the trees can't just rebuild or fix them. They have to rebuild them, and that takes time. And in the meantime, insects can smell that these trees are drought stressed. They don't have enough sap to physically push out those insects, or the sap also has the chemical components that are repellent to insects or toxic or antimicrobial to the fungi that they can vector to further kill the trees. And so these trees, being really drought stressed, just cannot protect themselves from insects. So these are the main insect groups that I'm going to talk about today. We divvy them up into functional groups. Basically, how are they affecting the tree? And so bark beetles are the first one. And I'm going to spend the most time on bark beetles because they're the most impactful. Now, all the bark beetles I'm going to talk about that are pests or major pests on our landscape in Oregon, they're actually all native, and they're only pests when they build up in number that can overwhelm the defenses of the tree. Next, I'll go into wood borers. They actually burrow into the wood. What's real confusing, though, is that some wood borers don't go very deeply in the wood. They behave like a bark beetle, and they just hang out underneath the bark. And I'll tell you why that makes them more damaging. Next, defoliators, they basically just eat the leaves of the tree. And then we have sap-sucking insects that they're damaging the leaves of the tree, and sometimes they can suck through the other tissues of the tree, such as branches or the trunk of the tree. But what they are doing is basically just kind of sitting themselves down, staying in one place and sucking the juices out of the tree, similar to an aphid. That's kind of in that same group. And so I'm going to spend a little less time on those last two groups because they tend to be not as impactful on our landscape on a larger scale, or they're more periodic versus bark beetles that every year we have this issue in certain problem areas. So let's start with bark beetles. So bark beetles are really tiny. They're about the size of a grain of rice, or half the size of a grain of rice. So really small, but they're opportunistic. So that means that they are preying on trees that are already stressed. They cannot take out a healthy tree, and they want a living tree. They want that fresh phloem to feed on, but they want it to be stressed, because if that tree isn't stressed, they can push out pitch and drown these beetles. These insects communicate via different chemical signaling, so they can pick up that, for example, Douglas fir beetle is a bark beetle that goes after Douglas fir. It can smell that that's a Douglas fir. It smells those green leaf volatiles, those scents that are coming off of the tree. That's that chemical profile recognized by Douglas fir beetle as being Douglas fir, their host. They can also smell that that tree is stressed, so they're releasing those stress chemicals that are very attracted to the insect. So the beetle will start digging into the tree. They just go right under the bark. They don't go into the wood. They're not a wood borer. They just stay right underneath the bark. If they like what they see, that this is a good food source, they want to make a brood, they will then send out a pheromone to attract others to come in. They're attracting mates, and they're also attracting other cogeners that can overcome the defenses of the tree. They're saying, come on in, we need to overwhelm this tree, drain it of its sap so it cannot pitch us out, and we can overwhelm the defenses of the tree. Once they reach a critical mass in population, they send out a repellent pheromone that says, okay, we don't want to use up our resources, no more. We are at our holding capacity. And so in that way, they're very successful in that they're able to moderate how much of their resource they can withhold for themselves and not overwhelm their population. They are feeding on the phloem and cambium layer. That's right underneath the bark. So as I mentioned, they are not going deeply into the wood. If anything, they might slightly score the exterior portion of the wood, but they're really just going right underneath the bark. And when they do that, they're creating these galleries for their brood that cuts across the vascular tissues of the tree. So it's like cutting off the veins of the tree, preventing translocation of moisture and nutrients. And so that kills the tree pretty effectively. In addition, they can also vector fungi that are not rotting the wood, but they are clogging the vascular tissues. So the fungi will grow through those same vascular tissues and clog them. And so it's a 1-2 punch that the beetle is cutting across some of the vascular tissues and the fungus is growing through the rest of the vascular tissues to girdle those trees. So let me go through some diagnostic features so you can determine when you see damage from bark beetles. And I do want to mention, these are natives that I'll be talking about, and I'm going to highlight 2 here today, and the scenarios in which they can become pests. But we have an overwhelming number of bark beetles, and they're not pests, and they can live in these trees in smaller number, and the trees can withstand them in getting into those trees. However, if they get in large number and they create a lot of galleries, then they can actually kill the trees. So one of the diagnostic features of bark beetles is the brood galleries that they're making. So these little chambers that they create where they mate, they lay eggs, the eggs hatch into larvae, feed, turn into pupa, and then they chew their way out as an adult. Each species of bark beetle makes a very distinct gallery, and you can identify the gallery or the species of the bark beetle by the gallery. And so I just showed some examples here. So if you know the host tree you're looking at and you can see this pattern underneath that bark, you can likely figure out what species of bark beetle you're looking at that has infested the tree. Here are some other diagnostic features of the signs and symptoms of bark beetles specifically. So first, some trees, mostly Douglas fir and true fir, they can exude a single stream of pitch where the beetle is entering, and they're basically breaking those resin ducts as they're chewing underneath the bark and just etching into the vascular tissue a little bit. And so the tree is trying to defend itself, and it pushes out pitch to try and drown those insects. And also remember, pitch has that repellent chemical property. And so if a tree has enough moisture to produce pitch, they can successfully save themselves from these bark beetle attacks. However, if there are many attacks, the tree just cannot keep ahead of these beetles and they will die. And so what you'll see in Doug fir and true fir is maybe a single stream of pitch or a single droplet. It's really slight, and oftentimes you don't really see that diagnostic feature. You may see it more so in pine trees. So in that central picture, those are what's called pitch tubes, and pine produces also a stream of pitch. They're just small, but they just clump up into a little tube. And you can see in that top picture, that's actually a tiny bark beetle that's been caught in one of those pitch tubes successfully. Probably one of the more significant diagnostic features that you can determine if any bark beetle has gotten into a tree is brown frass. And what frass is just a boring dust. So they are chewing in as adults to lay eggs underneath the bark. And as they chew and create their galleries, they're kicking out all this sawdust that they're chewing. They're not feeding on that sawdust per se. They are just chewing it up and passing it through their body or spitting it out and kicking it out of the tree. And so you'll see all these little piles of brown or brownish red frass. If it's white, that's a different beetle that's getting into wood, because these just get into the bark, it's brown. And that's a diagnostic feature that's really easy to determine if you have bark beetles. Now, I wouldn't be concerned if you just see a pile of frass here and there on a tree. That's totally normal. Remember, Low levels of bark beetles are always present in these trees, but if you see a bunch, and by a bunch, I mean like in this picture, that this is probably less than 2 feet of length of tree, and there's a whole bunch of frass that has been produced in that tree. If you are able to do some destructive sampling or pick up branches that have fallen on the ground, you peel back the bark, you can see the gallery. And the gallery is etched on the interior side of the bark and sometimes on the exterior part of the wood, as you can see in that picture. Sometimes you might even see the insects themselves. You can see how tiny they are there. Those are larvae and pupae in the bottom and one single adult at the top. And then once they are done doing their thing, they will chew and exit out. So the parents will lay eggs, and then the parents typically die within the tree, depending upon the species. And then their brood, that second generation, or the first generation, I should say, those are the ones that then will exit out of that tree and look for a different tree to attack, because that tree has already been used up. They will go to a different tree. And when they are chewing their way out, they turn. And so they chew a perfectly round, tiny exit hole that's the diameter of a grain of rice. As I mentioned, they can also vector fungal stains that grow in rays across the wood. You see that after the damage has been there for quite a while, it takes a while for the fungus to spread. In some of these beetles, you'll see woodpecker flecking. So the woodpecker can hear some of these species of beetles that come a little bit closer to the surface, sometimes actually back into the bark. And the woodpeckers will shave off the exterior bark, trying to pick out those grubs. So this is pretty extensive damage seen in ponderosa. You may also see it from another insect in Douglas fir, and I'll discuss that. And then eventually the tree is going to change color. The needles are going to die back. The whole tree is dying. Sometimes it's just the top third that dies back first, and then the rest of it turns red. Sometimes the whole thing turns red at once. There are cases in which you might see the top third of a tree die back, but then the tree keeps living. That's unusual, but that can happen if the tree is real persistent and it's trying to tolerate those attacks. But typically, once those needles are all red, that tree is dead. It's not going to green back up. It has been killed, and it's no longer a reservoir. Those beetles have left. They do not want to continue feeding in this tree because it's dead. It's not supplying the fresh living cambium and phloem that those beetles require. And so they'll move on to the next adjacent green tree. They don't want to fly very far. They just go to the next tree that seems sufficient for food for them. And then this tree is attacked by other beetles and other insects that are starting the decomposition process. So how do you know when the beetles are gone? Well, you look for those exit holes, those tiny round exit holes, and those holes don't go into the wood. Now, if those holes go into wood, that's a different insect, and it's typically a decomposer, and it's not killing that tree. If you see that flaked off bark, those beetles are usually gone. If you see the red needles, the beetles are usually gone. And so if you're trying to do any sort of sanitation, removing infested trees, you don't want to spend your time removing a bunch of red trees that have exit holes. You want to look to the adjacent green trees where you see piles of frass, so you know that the beetles have entered, but you see no exit holes and the leaves haven't changed color yet. Now, I will say, with sanitation, it's pretty hard to stay on top of it and stay ahead of the beetles unless it's an intensive effort. So I don't usually advise that unless you're in it for the long haul. Here's one other example of where do you think the beetles are still present. So in the left picture, the top third of that tree is dead. The right picture, there's a little pocket of mortality. You want to start looking to where the green trees are and see if you see the signs and symptoms of initial beetle entry, that frass, but no exit holes. And so they were where the red arrows are, and they're then headed to where the yellow arrows are. They do not want to fly far. They can fly further if they need to, but they don't typically want to fly far because they don't have a lot of fat storage when they come out of those trees. So these are the major bark beetle pests that we deal with in the Oregon landscape and forestry. Now, these are all native, and really only a couple are really problematic on the landscape. And there are particular scenarios that you can use to address preventing them and sometimes mitigating them. But these are all native. They're widespread across the state. They're common. Seeing them in small number is totally natural and normal in a forested ecosystem. However, when you have a stressed stand or a stressed clump of trees, then you can possibly be predisposed to an outbreak of these insects because they really key in on those stress situations. So I'll run through these really quickly, but there's only two that I want to spend a lot of time on. That is Douglas fir beetle and Ips. So Douglas fir beetle goes after large diameter Douglas fir. They really like blowdown. They'll infest in the blowdown, and then they will build their populations and hit adjacent standing trees. Because we have so much Douglas fir in Oregon, we obviously have a lot of fodder for this pest. And so we see Douglas fir beetle quite a bit on the landscape, and we see outbreaks here and there periodically. Next, we have fir engraver that attacks true fir. So Douglas fir is different from true fir. True fir is Abies genera. It's a totally different genus of trees. And we see true fir being attacked by fir engraver typically when it's super drought stressed, there's root disease, and often where true fir has started to spread into fringe habitat due to fire suppression. So what has naturally controlled true fir in some parts of the landscape is no longer being enacted there. True fir is allowed to proliferate in areas where it's not really adapted to anymore. It's too dry, and these beetles will pick off those trees. Next are Ips beetles. That's a bark beetle that gets into all sorts of pine trees, and it really likes small diameter. So it will go after either smaller diameter trees, so real young trees, or it goes after the tops or branches of larger trees, and they build up and slash. So I'll talk to you a little bit more about Ips and how you can manage for Ips. And then Western pine beetle goes after ponderosa only, and they typically like the really large, less vigorous trees. Oftentimes they attack trees that are really drought stressed or really damaged by wildfire, but still living. And then last is mountain pine beetle that will also attack any species of pine. We see it in the majority in lodgepole pine, typically because lodgepole springs up in dense dog hair stands where they come in after wildfire and populate a site because their cones need that heat to open up and germinate. And then they just spring up in large number, outcompeting each other for moisture. And so we often have large tracts of lodgepole that's really drought stressed, and this beetle keys in on that lodgepole. It can also spread into adjacent ponderosa and other pine species. So I'm going to discuss a little bit more about Doug fir beetle and Ips, because these are the two that we actually have some additional techniques to manage for. But I do want to note, for all of these insects, you're basically doing the same thing for management. It's all preventative management. There's not a lot you can do that's mitigative or after an outbreak has occurred to stay on top of it or to control it. Oftentimes you have to wait for that outbreak to collapse on its own. And usually at some point they will. As I mentioned, insects outcompete each other for food. They spread diseases. They are just overpopulated in an area. And so those outbreaks will often collapse on their own, but sometimes just not as quickly as we want them to. So to stay ahead of that, we need to make sure our trees and our stands of trees are as healthy as possible. And the biggest way to do that is by enhancing the amount of moisture that they have on site. Thinning is a big one. Prescribed fire to reduce some of those understory fuels that might be also outcompeting these trees for moisture, but also predisposing a stand to catastrophic wildfire risk. So these major tools as preventative management for beetles are also great preventative management for a drought stress stand or to prevent catastrophic wildfire. So we can use the same exact tools, thinning, prescribed fire, to combat multiple things: insects, drought, wildfire. And that's all we have to do. Now, it seems like a big lift. It's really expensive, but it's a lot more expensive to try and fix something after the fact. It's better off to make our trees as resilient as possible by enhancing their health. But as I mentioned, there are a couple of other tools that we have against those two beetles. And so Douglas fir beetle is one that we see extensively on the landscape. And when we typically see an outbreak, it's near a site that has storm damage. And oftentimes it's worse in areas that have been droughted and they have storm damage. But we are seeing that more and more in our landscape in Oregon. And what this beetle likes about storm damage is you have these big trees. They like a large diameter Douglas fir that have recently blown down. So within the past year, these trees have fallen down. So they're effectively dead. They don't have as much moisture running through them because their roots have been broken off as they've fallen over, but they're still moist enough. They still have tissue that's succulent, and it's interesting to this beetle to raise their brood. And so these beetles will target those down trees first. They're basically stressed trees that are still alive, and they infest in those down trees and build up their population. And that first generation then comes out of that blowdown and attacks adjacent standing trees. When you see those attacks, it typically starts in April, the April after the blowdown event. You'll see that frass, as I mentioned, that key diagnostic feature for bark beetles. And then they're burrow in, they spend a year in that material, and then they'll exit out. You'll see the exit holes and they'll hit the adjacent green trees. And you'll see this kind of outbreak growing out from the central point, as you can see in this bottom picture. However, before that 1st April, you can prevent the insects from even attacking that blowdown material. Or if you don't act quickly enough, you can still prevent them from leaving those trees and getting into your standing trees the next April. And the way that you do that is you either get in there right after storm damage and remove that down material before April, get it off site, process it, whatever you need to do. Or you can apply a product called MCH, and that is a repellent pheromone, and I'll show you more in the next slide. But if you do both of those things or just one of those things right before April, you have a good chance of preventing Douglas fir beetle from concentrating at your site and building up in that blowdown material. If you can't get to it before that 1st April, before they even get to that site and build a number, you can then do it before the 2nd April. So they've already gotten into the blowdown. Then you still have time to remove that blowdown or put up that MCH so that any insects that might still be present in that blowdown material do not spread to the adjacent trees. They are scattered on the landscape. Because the way that this MCH works is that it's the same pheromone that the beetle puts out itself, saying there are not enough resources here, no vacancy, we need to maintain our population at this level. And so we actually utilize that in a little pouch. It's the same product. You staple it up to trees in a grid. And what it's doing is it's repelling the insect. The insect flies around an area looking for a tree that smells good, but all it smells is this repellent pheromone that tells it, no, don't enter, don't enter. So then they scatter on the landscape. In doing that, they don't concentrate in an area, so they can't overcome the defenses of a single tree. And so that tree has a better chance of withstanding the fewer beetles that are on the landscape. In addition, the beetles are searching for a tree that smells good, that they can infest, and they're limiting their fat stores. They have limited fat stores when they come out as fresh adults. They haven't eaten very much as they have exited. They are hungry. They're looking for food. And if they have to search and search for a tree that smells good, they will die in that process. So this is a pretty effective product if it's applied correctly. It's really cheap. It's a general use pesticide. It costs anywhere from $3 to $6 for a bubble cap. That's what I'm showing in that picture there. And then, like I said, you'll staple it in a grid, usually about every 30 feet. You can also put them in double, triple, quadruple them up on a tree and then step that spacing out a bit further to save you some time. But there's that fact sheet that has more information about how this is applied, some different strategies, really useful product, especially if applied on a smaller scale. It's a little bit easier to manage that way because it is a lot of work to staple all this material up, but it's a good way to give yourself a little bit of extra insurance so that you don't have a Doug fir beetle outbreak after you have storm damage. The next example of a bark beetle that we do have some other strategies to prevent outbreaks for is for ips. And so the way this insect works is it actually has a much shorter development turnaround time than the Doug fir beetle I mentioned. It doesn't take a year like Doug fir beetle. It only takes about 2 to 3 months to go from egg to adult. So that's a really quick turnaround. So they can build populations more quickly. And they really like slash material. They like that small diameter pine and they like fresh slash. So slash that was created recently, they get into that, they build up in that material, and then they spread, their subsequent populations will spread to the adjacent standing trees that are still living and fresh and healthy. And then we'll start picking those trees off. And the same thing goes, you'll see frass once they have attacked. You won't often see the pitch that I'm pointing at there, that tiny little pitch tube. And even if you do see attacks, often if it's a larger tree, they're at the top of the tree or they're at the branches. So it can be hard to spot. But one distinguishing feature is when these beetles kill a pine tree, the top third of the pine tree dies. So if you see that in your pine tree, you can be pretty sure that you have ips and or drought issues. And this insect is very tightly related to drought. So when drought hits a tree, ips tend to build up in those trees as well. And so the mitigative factors for this insect are to just destroy that slash. So you can burn it, you can chip it, you can bury it within 2 to 3 months of creation if it's in spring and summer. And I know that's a pretty tight turnaround, especially if it's spring and summer and we run into burn bans. So if you're doing any work that creates fresh pine slash, if you do try to focus your creation of pine slash in October through December, you can actually just scatter that material on the ground, and it breaks down enough so that come April, when this beetle tends to start flying, it's not really as interested in that slash material. So October through December, you can scatter that material on the ground and leave it. You're probably pretty safe. If it's spring or summer or anytime right before April, you're creating that slash, you want to try and chip or burn or bury it. And this is an example of an IPS outbreak. It starts at the top third and it spreads out into a pocket from tree to tree. They don't like to fly far. Next, I'm going to move into the next functional group, which is wood borers. And I want to distinguish bark beetles versus wood borers because bark beetles are typically the tree killers and wood borers are just the start of decomposition. I am going to highlight a couple of wood borers that are more problematic. And the reason why they can kill trees is because they behave like a bark beetle. And so I will distinguish those. But many of these wood boring beetles, they get into the wood. They're not damaging to the tree in terms of killing the tree. They can cause defect by creating tunnels and fungus in the tree that if you're trying to sell it, it actually reduces the merchantability. So it's just that defect lowers the value of the wood. Quite often, these are beetles. There are other types of wood-boring insects, wasps, etc., but it's the larvae that are doing the majority of the damage. The adults and the larvae can be very large. Some are a bit small. Some of the adults are pretty flashy. So in this next picture, there are two main groups of wood borers. Well, there's three. I'm going to talk about ambrosia beetles in a minute. But the ones that really stand out are the roundhead and flathead beetles. They're called roundhead because the larvae are cylindrical, flathead because the heads look squished. So on the left, you'll see flatheads. The larva has a squished head. It kind of looks like a horseshoe nail. And the right, that larva just looks like a cylindrical worm. So slight difference there. But the adults have a little bit more variation. So the flatheads on the bottom, the adults are called jewel beetles. And oftentimes they're really metallic, colorful. Not always, but typically they've got a little bit of flash to them. They have shorter antennae. They're shaped kind of, they're long and narrow and kind of bullet shaped. However, the roundheads have longhorn beetle adults, and those have really long antennae. Some of them can have some flashy colors and patterns, but a lot of them are brown or black or kind of drab. They lay their eggs on the outside of the tree, unlike the bark beetle. The eggs hatch into larvae. The larvae chew their way in. They feed in the wood, pupate, and exit out as adults. They also turn, and so they can create, or they move side to side, and they can create perfectly round or perfectly oval exit holes. They're not sloppy in the holes that they make, but most of these wood borers do not kill trees. They're just decomposers. But I am going to note that there are several that are tree killers, and I'll get into those in just a minute. So here's diagnosis for wood borers. Typically, it's white frass that you'll see. Sometimes you'll see some frass in the interior of the bark, but you won't see frass pushed out of the tree that's brown from a wood borer. It'll either be white or you won't see any frass. Next, you'll see tunnels and holes in the wood. So they actually enter the wood if it's a wood borer. Remember, there are a couple that don't play by those rules, and I'll show you the examples of those and those diagnostic features. And then the holes can be pretty variable in size, but they are round or oval. So this is the first of our wood borers that can actually kill trees. It's the flat-headed fir borer. This is seen statewide. However, particularly in Southwest Oregon, we've seen a lot of activity from this beetle because we've had a lot of Douglas fir that is highly stressed. This insect likes Douglas fir. It likes really stressed Douglas fir, stressed by wildfire damage, drought, root disease, etc. It doesn't matter if the tree is really stressed. These beetles are really good at seeking it out. And this beetle actually can kill those trees, unlike other wood borers, because it behaves like a bark beetle. It goes right underneath the bark and it girdles the tree. So it's cutting across the phloem and cambium tissues rather than diving deep into, for example, the heartwood, which is just structural and doesn't provide any vascular tissues that are still living. So this insect is really common in our really stressed landscapes, especially if we have rocky sites. We have sites with thin or poor soil, serpentine soils. And what we're seeing more and more, especially moving up into the northern part of the Willamette Valley, where we've had many Doug firs living for many years on sites that seem pretty healthy, well, suddenly these trees have gotten a dose of pretty heavy duty drought that they just can't adapt to, and they're not doing well. And this beetle is picking them off one by one. And the ways to diagnose if you have this beetle on site is there will be tiny little pitch pearls or just little individual droplets of pitch, typically in the furrows of the bark. So you got to look close. You'll see these little tiny droplets of pitch, not a pitch flow, not a large pitch mass, just a tiny little droplet. You might see some oval exit holes. There are a lot of wood borers that create those oval exit holes. But if you see a larva that is in the bark, as I show in that bottom middle picture, and it looks flattened, that's typically going to be a flathead. And that's going to be flat-headed fir borer, because they typically, the wood boring group that looks similar to this one, they go into the wood. However, this insect, it stays on the outside of that wood and in the bark. And so if you see this larva that's that large in that position on the tree, then that's likely to be a flathead fir borer Douglas fir. But really the main defining feature is if you see a Douglas fir that has shaved off bark. This insect, because it goes into the bark, it's very close to the surface. Woodpeckers can hear it moving around. It shaves that bark back and it plucks those grubs out. So these are some high risk scenarios. To the top right, it's drought, and the seed lot or the adaptability of the seed that was planted there maybe is just not adapted to that site anymore. It's just too dry. Catastrophic wildfire, or other factors that contribute to poor site quality, such as thin soils, being exposed to a lot of sunlight, so a south-facing slope, or being along an edge. Those are areas that the Douglas fir is just inherently going to be more stressed, and flathead fir borer is going to pick them off. Another wood-boring beetle that is killing trees, that is a pest issue, is the emerald ash borer. You may have heard of our recent detection a few years ago. Now, this insect is native to Asia. It has moved through North America, was first detected in 2002 in Michigan. It's now in 36 states, and it was detected in Oregon in 2022, and I'll give you a little bit more information about that. But first, it's attacking ash trees. It also can attack other trees in the Oleaceae family. That's the olive family. Also includes fringe tree, but it really prefers ash, and it does really well on ash. And the reason why this insect can kill our ash trees is because, number one, it is an invasive. So our ash trees have not co-evolved with it. They are not defended against it. They don't know what to do when they're attacked by this insect. They do not have the chemical compounds that were adapted to resist this insect or tolerate its damage. Second, this insect does not burrow deeply into the wood. It stays right underneath the bark like a bark beetle, girdling those vascular tissues. The larvae are cutting across it with their sinuous galleries, as you can see in that picture. And this insect is perfectly green, very narrow, makes D-shaped exit holes as it exits. But the key features to look for are, is this an ash tree? Do you see thinning of the crown or some dieback, or maybe some epicormic shoots or shoots growing from the bottom of the tree? Take a closer look. Do you see cracks in the bark? Do you see shaving from woodpeckers? Do you see a whole bunch of exit holes? And do some of those exit holes look D-shaped? If you have any one of these features, we definitely want you to report that to us. It really helps if you see that it's an ash tree, and then there's some features that are pretty unique to the emerald ash borer, in addition to the stress features from the ash. What I mean by that is it's an ash tree, it's got some signs of stress. Do you see some exit holes? Or do you see some cracks in the bark? Do you see something else that might link it to it being from an insect? So this is the progression of the insect. It got here through imports, and that's imports from overseas, but also people moving firewood from state to state or around states, travel on nursery plants. There are a lot of different ways that insects move into a country or move state to state. So move very quickly across our nation. However, we were prepared for it. We figured it was a matter of time before it got here. We had plans in place on how we were going to tackle it. And so we are actively monitoring and controlling to try and slow the spread of the population. It was first detected in Forest Grove. Since then, we have worked really hard to try and contain it as much as possible. So currently, it's still contained in Washington County in a 10.5 square mile area. We have not detected it outside of this area. And where this insect has invaded, it's killed almost all of the ash trees in very short order. And the reason for that is because these trees aren't defended, as I mentioned, but also it's hard to detect the initial infestation from this insect until the tree is showing obvious signs of stress. And then you know that the beetle is there. So it can be hard to detect. So all the more reason for you to keep your eyes peeled so you see the first symptom and can report it back to us so we can determine where else it might be present in the state. Now, this insect has never been successfully eradicated. We are working more so on slowing the spread. That's going to buy us more time to employ some better methods on the landscape, underplant with some different trees, just reducing the population of the emerald ash borer in an area and also reducing how quickly it can spread out from that area. And we've been pretty successful at trying to contain that spread, because the spread of this insect is going to contribute to high economic and ecological costs in the loss of this tree. Ash trees are essential on our landscape. Now, Oregon ash is our only native ash. It's not widespread throughout the state, but what its import is that it's present in areas often that are ephemeral water sources. This is one of the few native tree species we have that can withstand totally dry roots for part of the year and then wet roots for another part of the year. It's often found along stream banks, ephemeral or consistent stream banks. So it's helping with bank stabilization, shading of those streams. It's habitat for threatened and endangered species. It's an important indigenous resource for making canoe paddles, for example, medicines, really important species that we want to try and retain on our landscape. So part of that effort with Slow the Spread is determining where else it might be present. And so I want you to be very clear on what kind of damage does it do, so you can identify if you might possibly see emerald ash borer on your landscape, especially if it's in other parts of the state that we're not aware of yet. So remember, first, is it an ash tree? If you determine that it's an ash tree, does it have symptoms of stress? Does it have top kill, a thinning crown, so it's lost some leaves prematurely, epicormic shoots or branches coming out from the base or outside of the crown? Take a closer look. Do you see bark splits? Do you see any sort of woodpecker shaving or D-shaped exit holes? Now, a lot of holes are made in ash trees, so I want you to know what the emerald ash borer does versus what it does not. So to the left is emerald ash borer. That's the D-shaped exit hole. Not all the holes are perfectly D-shaped, but you can see it's pretty small versus the pictures to the right. So sap-sucking woodpecker makes a whole row of holes. That is not emerald ash borer or any other insect. It's from a woodpecker just going after sap. If it's a real tiny hole, that is not emerald ash borer. If it's a sloppy hole that doesn't look like a drill bit went through it, it has a sloppy perimeter, that's from a different type of woodpecker. And if it's too large, so know like the approximate size. So that's all the same finger in those pictures. So it's not very helpful to show you scale if you don't know how large that finger is. But there are a lot of guides that I have and links later on in this presentation that you can do a little bit more research than I have time to provide here on looking at keys for what is emerald ash borer attack versus what is not. So for management for emerald ash borer, take stock of your ash trees and monitor their health. Have a plan. What's going to happen if emerald ash borer moves close to your area? You want to know, how are you going to destroy that tree? Are you going to replace it? What are you going to replace it with? Or do you want to do some preventative management in terms of applying a systemic insecticide that's pumped into the tree? We suggest emamectin benzoate. It lasts for 3 years at the lowest dose. It works very well. However, it's expensive and it's not without effects on non-target insects that are also present underneath that bark. We are asking folks to avoid planting ash. Just save yourself the time and trouble, because at a certain point, emerald ash borer will reach you. Do not move firewood. So buy it where you burn it. And when you know of infested material, you want to treat it. And treatment consists of burning the material, chipping, masticating, that's just grinding it down, or kiln drying it for a core temperature of 60 degrees Celsius for 70 minutes. And we do want you to report infestations. And I have a whole bunch of links here. Sorry for the color of the font. I couldn't adjust that. But I did provide the PDF of this presentation so that you have access to all of these links later. Now I'm going to move a little bit more quickly so I save enough time for questions. But the next group of wood-boring beetles that I want to talk about are ambrosia beetles. And ambrosia beetles are very small, just like all the bark beetles that I talked about.
Christine,
Yes.
I just wanted to interrupt just quickly. I think you should be fine. The group who's here is not very big, so we shouldn't have a whole lot of questions. So you should be fine on time, but 7:30 is our time.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you for that. Ambrosia beetles are very small, like a bark beetle, but they do actually get into the wood. So they dive straight into that wood. You can see the galleries at the bottom right and the middle pictures there where the adults are chewing into the tree and they just keep going, creating these branched galleries. In addition, they're vectoring a fungus, and that fungus is actually what they're feeding on. So these insects are not feeding on wood at all. They are feeding on the fungus that they're planting in these gardens. So these galleries are kind of populated with this fungus, and they're feeding that on that themselves as adults and for their brood. So they're laying eggs in these galleries and everybody is feeding on the fungus. The problem with these beetles is that they're not necessarily girdling the trees because it's a very small gallery that just cuts right straight through the tree. However, it's the fungus that they're vectoring. And many ambrosia beetles that we have in our landscape, native and non-native, are not tree killers. And they're not a problem at all, except for they can cause defect if you're selling a tree for timber. But they're not killing the tree. However, we do have a few ambrosia beetles that vector fungus that actually can cause disease in trees, and it can clog those vascular tissues, just as I'd mentioned before, that doesn't allow the transport of water and nutrients throughout the tree. And so that fungus, it's really important to know which beetle you're working with because some can actually kill the tree and some do not. These are examples of ambrosia beetle damage. So they also create frass just like other wood borers that's white because they get into the wood. They're chewing through that wood. They're spitting it out and kicking it out, pushing all that boring dust outside. And ambrosia beetles, they're very small. So their jaws are very small and they're chewing up wood very finely. So that's usually a very powdered white frass that you see on the exterior. And this frass from any of these beetles can wash away or blow away over time. But typically you'll see it in the bark furrows. Sometimes you'll see it collecting in moss or spider webs or around the base of the tree. And then if you can, again, look under the bark, do some destructive sampling. If it's a tree that you don't mind sacrificing, or if you have maybe branches that have dropped in the ground, you can peel the bark back and you can look and see if there are holes that penetrated, that they were in the bark, but also in the wood. And that's going to tell you that it's not a bark beetle. It's a tiny little hole, but it's not a bark beetle because it actually went deeper into the wood. Additionally, if it's ambrosia beetle, you're going to see those black staining around those holes. And you can see some of that evidence there in the pictures in the middle. And then the galleries are pretty distinct. They're these branch galleries that cut through in a cross section in the bole of the tree. So as I mentioned, most ambrosia beetles that we have in our landscape in Oregon, not a problem. We don't worry about them. Until recently, we detected an invasive that is problematic and is killing some of our oak trees. So this is Mediterranean oak borer. This has a wide range all the way from different countries in Europe through North Africa, through the Middle East. So very extensive range. It infests many different species of trees, and where it's native, it's not really a problem because it's picking off all of their sick trees, similar to our native system, where if we have sick trees, our native insects can just pick them off to make room for the more vigorous trees. However, our trees are not used to this insect. They did not co-evolve defenses against this insect. So in this way, Mediterranean oak borer has been able to kill our oak trees. And so far, we have only found them in oak trees. We're not the only state that has this insect. California found them first in 2017. We found a single adult in a trap that we were setting out for detection along known pathways where invasives could come in. We do place sentinel traps here and there to try and have the first intercept when we find something so we can act quickly. And so we did find in 2018 a single adult. Subsequent trapping around the same area yielded no individuals. So sometimes you'll have a one-off that maybe an insect came out of a shipment that came in from overseas, for example, but they didn't establish here. However, in 2022, we started finding this beetle in trees and it was actively killing trees. And so it did start to establish here. We are finding it still in small number, but we are finding it more extensively each year since 2022. We've only found it in oak, same as in California. They've only found it in oak. However, we've only found it in white oak. California has found it in blue oak and valley oak. And so we've only found it in our Oregon white oak. We have not seen it in any other oak trees yet. But in all the oak species it's attacking, it vectors a fungus that causes a vascular wilt. And it's that vascular wilt is actually powerful enough that it can kill the trees. It really clogs up those vascular tissues. And unfortunately, this insect doesn't really have much of a dormant period. While it has no incentive to leave trees actively once it finds a good food source, it is active for most of the year. And so they're pretty durable, and you'll see them outside the tree even during cold periods. And so not transferring infested material is of high importance. We did not actually determine that, we did determine that this insect did not arrive here from California. So when we did a DNA analysis on some specimens, they were from a different genetic population than the California population, meaning we received our own shipment of Mediterranean oak borer from elsewhere. So we can't blame it on California for transporting it up here. And so far, we've only found it attacking trees or in traps in 4 counties. So that's in Multnomah, Washington, Marion, and Clackamas counties. As I mentioned, it attacks multiple different species of oak, but we have only seen it attacking white oak. These are insects, again, that are not feeding on wood. They're feeding on the fungus that they're vectoring. So far, we have detected 2 fungi that are responsible for the vascular wilt that's killing these trees. And then, as I mentioned, they are active for most of the year. We think they might have about 2 or 3 generations in Oregon, not quite sure. We haven't had enough time to track it, and there is no huge incentive for them to leave trees as long as they have a good food source. However, if there's a nearby tree and they get overpopulated in their initial tree, or that tree has died, they will then move on to an additional tree. But so far, we have not seen widespread mortality in trees just yet. I don't need to explain to this group probably the importance of Oregon white oak. It's native. Often the main overstory component in our oak savannas, which is a really important wildlife habitat and ecosystem in Oregon, provides a lot of habitat and food sources for a lot of different wildlife. And also, this is a very drought tolerant and long lived tree. We do not want to lose this tree on our landscape. It's one of our most important trees that's going to persist in these years that we have intensifying drought. So really important tree that we're really trying to protect on our landscape. So with that being said, I want you to know what Mediterranean oak borer attack does, how to report it, so you can get back to us with any other reports outside of our known infestation area, which is mainly in Clackamas County. We have found some infested trees in Multnomah County as well. Those are being quickly destroyed. It's just a handful, whereas we have about 30 in Clackamas County in the Wilsonville area. But the first thing you want to look at is it an oak tree? The second, do you see canopy dieback? That's more extensive than just a few leaves here and there throughout the canopy. It's either a whole branch or a whole section of crown that is turned red. If so, if you can take a closer look, you can report it to us at that point, but we do prefer you take a closer look to look for some additional symptoms because we are spread pretty thin these days. And those additional symptoms are that pale boring dust, so that frass, that sawdust, anywhere around the base or along the trunk, looking for that. Sometimes you can see holes, but even more helpful than the holes is if you can see any sort of gallery. And so if there are drop branches on the ground, you can peel back the bark to look in the wood, or you see a cross section of a cut piece of wood and you see these black branch galleries or holes that are surrounded by black staining. That's very useful. But if you see an oak that has crown dieback, we do want you to report it. And if you additionally see frass, that is very helpful information for us to be aware of. I also want to point out things that are not Mediterranean oak borer so we don't get false reports. And the primary one I want to note is the one number 4. If you see just a few leaves here and there throughout the canopy that have turned red, that is not Mediterranean oak borer. That's a gall wasp, and then squirrels doing subsequent damage digging for those gall wasps. So those do not kill trees. We see it every year. The trees rebound. Remember, oak is a broadleaf tree that is also deciduous, so it drops its leaves every year, so it can withstand quite a bit of leaf damage. So that's a big one to look out for. And then any sort of larger holes in the wood, that is not from Mediterranean oak borer. This insect is very tiny, about half the size of a grain of rice, very small insect. And so thus it creates very small holes. So what can you do to protect your oaks? Anything you can do to protect the health of the oaks. What we have seen is that Mediterranean oak borer is targeting, at least initially, really stressed oaks. Oaks that have extensive fungal rots, they have a lot of construction around them that might be compacting the roots around their base. Those are typically attacked first. So promoting the health of the tree may help them withstand these insects. If you have the ability to do so, let's say you have one large oak tree in your yard, if you can give it one overnight plug of slow drip moisture and follow that fact sheet for how much moisture you want to give a tree, you want to give it sufficient moisture, that might be enough. Just one night a month in the hottest summer months might be enough to water your oak tree to help it combat this insect and other threats. Additionally, I will say that there are a lot of trees that have large unsupported branches that break off in storms. That unnatural breakage really damages the tissue of the tree, and it allows fungus to get in that stresses the tree and then further predisposes it to these insects. So if you have these large unsupported branches in your oak, you might want to preventatively remove them before they break off in a future storm. If you are aware of infested material, the only way to get rid of these insects is to burn or chip the material, or you can bury it. Our oak trees are really big, so this is a really big ask, and it's a difficult one. So we're pretty much trying to come up with some other strategies that are more feasible for landowners, because this is going to be a very expensive issue should this insect get to be more extensive damage. And here are some additional resources on where to report and how to identify this insect. Now, the last few insect groups I kind of grouped together because they're not as damaging, so they don't need as much detail paid to them. First one is defoliating insects. Oftentimes these are butterflies or moths, the caterpillars. The larval stage is what's doing the feeding on the leaves. And sometimes it can look quite devastating, but they can remove a lot of that leaf tissue. They create these large webs depending upon the species, and it looks really damaging. It's not aesthetically pleasing. However, most of the ones we see west of the Cascades tend to be ones that are tackling trees that are deciduous. So they're used to dropping their leaves. They're going to rebound from these insect attacks, even if they look quite extensive. Oftentimes the insects do not come back in the same spot the next year. The trees can rebound. They'll be just fine. So definitely don't worry about these as much. However, on the east side, we tend to struggle with a few defoliators of conifer trees. And why this is more damaging is because our conifer trees need to retain at least 2 to 3 years of their needle growth. And so if they have a huge defoliation event that takes out 2 to 3 of those years of needles that have built up, then that tree doesn't have a lot left to survive on. And the big ones that we worry about are western spruce budworm and Douglas fir tussock moth. They both get into true fir and Doug fir. What we do ask is help your trees tolerate this pest. Now, this is none of these insects really warrant treatment. It's very expensive and difficult to try and treat, and it's usually using insecticides. There are some more natural insecticides. However, they're really hard to apply and really expensive. We just typically advise people to wait it out, that these outbreaks will collapse on their own, even from some of the more damaging ones, or they're just periodic outbreaks, and just hang in there. We'll get through it. However, they can be damaging in some areas, especially if it's a site that's really stressed and the trees don't tend to do as well anyway. So if it's a really dry area, true fir and Doug fir aren't doing that well. They're going to have a harder time to rebound from defoliation. So keep that in mind with future planting. If you're living on the east side, you're planting Doug fir and true fir, plug them in the best spots where they have the best chance of success, so that they are really healthy, so they can withstand any attacks from these insects. The last insect on this slide is the large case bearer at the far right there. That is an invasive. However, it is so long established, and a lot of our natural controls and introduced biocontrols have been very successful at keeping this insect pest at lower population levels. And so we don't tend to worry about this one as much, because typically large drops their needles every year, and then it can actually rebound from the damage that this insect causes each year. Next on the defoliator list is spongy moth, previously called gypsy moth. This is an insect we look for every year. It's an invasive that the European variety has been long established in northeastern states and the Midwest. And causes extensive damage on hundreds of species of trees. However, the lucky thing here is this insect comes readily to traps The males come right to those baited lure traps that are baited with pheromone. So we can detect as soon as this moth is found on our landscape. And it is periodically found here because it gets here via shipments. The Asian variety comes in through overseas shipments. It can be transported on lots of different materials. Once it was traced back to a vehicle that was bought on eBay that had egg masses on the undercarriage. So it can get transported a lot of different ways, but it comes readily to traps, and that's what's made it really successful for us to eradicate this insect. It is never established in Oregon. Every time we find it in traps, we go to the site, we do follow-up trapping to isolate exactly where it is. We apply treatment, and then we continue trapping for a couple years after to ensure that it did not establish in that area, and we have been 100% successful with that. The next group are scale insects and adelgids, and these are chronic pests in areas because they just kind of hunker down on a plant and just stay there for a long time. Both of these insects work like aphids in that they just like hunker down on a leaf and they will stick their proboscis or their feeding mouth part into that leaf tissue and suck the juices out. And in that way, they are reducing the photosynthetic capacity and abilities of those leaves. Those leaves eventually die, they run out of nutrients. And so you'll get foliage loss, discoloration of the leaves. And if you look closer at the leaves, you'll see white or black specks or little pieces of fluff on those leaves. And that's definitely something you want to be aware of on your landscape. However, these insects tend to only be chronic pests in areas that are already really stressed, and you already know your trees are not doing that well there, and they're just a secondary factor. One that is more extensively damaging our trees that we are concerned with is balsam woolly adelgid, which is invasive. It's a long established invasive, but particularly in areas such as in the Northeast and along the Cascades at high elevation sites where we're already losing true fir due to climate change. It's just getting too dry for those non-drought tolerant species to persist. We have this balsam woolly adelgid that's slowly spreading from tree to tree, killing more and more of these trees in the landscape because it's very hard to control at some of those harder to reach areas. And even though this insect does not move that readily, it's chronic in those areas. And for as long as it's been here, it has the time to kind of move from tree to tree. Often it's moving through wind, transport on birds and other animals, or movement of infested material. And so sanitization, not moving that material in known infestation areas is really key. And these are just images of extensive damage from this insect. And then a couple of last slides that I have are, I think it's just as important to be aware of insects that are not pests that you frequently see on the landscape, just so you don't waste your time, money, and effort trying to control something that's not a pest. So the first one is red turpentine beetle. This is a bark beetle, goes under the bark, just like the rest of the bark beetles. However, it does not make extensive galleries, and it's very common, especially in wildfire damaged trees or trees that are already being affected by other beetles. So when you see large pitch tubes around the base of the tree, about 5 feet of the bottom of the tree, and then below it, you'll see this crumbly frass that looks just like grape nuts. And you can see it in that picture. Don't worry about those pitch tubes. If you see a lot of those pitch tubes, likely the rest of your tree doesn't look so good and you have another bark beetle issue, or you've had that tree be damaged by wildfire enough where you're already seeing that it's really stressed. The next insect is the sequoia pitch moth that I also included an additional slide here in case I had time. But you'll see really, really large pitch masses on the tree, and that's really an aesthetic issue. It looks like the insect is doing a lot of damage, but it's really not. The tree does exude a lot of pitch, but that's actually a good sign. When trees exude pitch, that shows they have enough moisture to defend themselves and seal off their wounds. That's really important for a tree to be able to seal off its wounds. So typically when you see a lot of pitch, you know something has happened to that tree, but it was able to try and heal itself. You just want to let it be. However, this can be an aesthetic issue. It's more common on Scots pine and mugo pine. These are non-natives, often planted in urban landscapes that are already really stressed. And this insect really likes to attack trees that are recently pruned in spring and summer. So if you can avoid pruning at that time of year to avoid that insect, that's really helpful. And remember, Ips bark beetles gets into pruned pine trees during that time too. So not a good time to do work on those trees. And then I already mentioned the defoliators of deciduous trees. Don't be concerned with that. It looks bad. the trees are going to rebound. So I did have that one extra slide about Sequoia pitch moth. I did just want to show you, it is one single individual underneath each one of those pitch masses. It's a single larva that's feeding under there. It's a moth that is laying these eggs. And you can do some manual removal when you start seeing these attacks and just peel back those soft pitch masses and destroy it, because it's just the larva underneath. So you can do some mechanical control there, which may help down the road, because the Sequoia pitch moth does like to hit the same parts of the tree and the same trees year after year. That's why you can see a tree that has tons and tons of pitch masses, such as the picture at the bottom right. So with that, that's all I've got. So I can open it up if folks have questions.
Well, that is fabulous, and they proved me wrong. They came up with a bunch of questions, so we'll try to get through those quickly. Maybe if you want to stop your share. Yeah, let's see. I'm gonna, I guess, start from the, well, no, that's not gonna work. Okay. So somebody asked what naturally consumes the emerald ash borer.
What naturally consumes emerald ash borer?
Yeah.
So woodpeckers are a big one. Our woodpeckers are attuned to going after insects like that. However, we don't have anything that is specialized, that's native, that's only attacking emerald ash borer or even attacking them in large number. But we have introduced 3 classic biocontrol agents. These are wasps that are very effective at controlling this insect. They've long been utilized. They've been tested vigorously to determine that they do not have non-target effects in terms of going after some of our native insects. But we don't have anything native that's really going after our emerald ash borer, but it's everything working together. And even those biocontrol agents, they're not going to do it on their own. So it's really a complex of things controlling emerald ash borer.
Okay. And then John Price says, is emerald ash borer likely to be a threat to olive groves? I know people are, the climate change, should we plant olives?
Right. So at this time, we're not seeing them attack olives in Oregon. And where this insect has been long established, they have attacked fringe tree and olive trees, however, not in large number. So it's kind of expected that if we get to a point where we totally run out of ash trees, then they could be very disastrous on those other species. But they really prefer ash. And as long as we have enough ash to feed them, which we will for quite some time, they probably won't spread into those other trees. If they have a perfectly good ash tree, they're probably not going to spread to those other trees. But if you have a single ash tree surrounded by a grove of olives, they likely will finish off that ash tree. And then what's the closest thing? They'll go to the olives or the fringe tree. But we're not seeing damage in those species here yet.
Okay. And then Larry, who I think said that he is, I think he's the one who said he's a master gardener in Portland, also said, we saw many large diameter Douglas fir trees fall over or blow down in far southwest Portland and Lake Oswego during the January storm. Could this phenomenon be related to laminated root rot, or is it just normal for Douglas firs in extreme weather events?
I would say both. And actually, I live in Southwest Portland, and my parents had a couple Doug fir fall in their house and total their car. So I saw it in action and went and investigated it, and they had laminated root disease. However, some of the blowdown that I've been seeing does not have evidence of root diseases. The roots are still intact. You can tell because it's a root disease and it's breaking down the tissue in the roots. And so if you look at the roots, if they look like they just broke off, typically, it's not going to just break off for no reason unless something is stressing those roots. However, I did see some trees where they maybe were rooted more shallowly. Maybe there was some hard pan underneath, or there's not a ton of moisture that they're receiving from down below. They kind of are growing more of their biomass closer to the surface to get some of that atmospheric rain that's coming down. And so they have more shallow roots. That leaves them more exposed to compaction, all of that. They're just not rooted in as deeply. They're more at risk. So it's both things, that a lot of those trees, yes, had some root disease, and that left them predisposed to a brisk wind could blow them over. And then in other trees, they didn't have any root disease. It's just a couple of other factors that were not helping that tree health that left them predisposed to that wind event.
Okay. Ray says, how does Mediterranean oak borer relate to gold-spotted oak borer that's in Southern California? And is it anticipated that GSOB will move north into the PNW?
Yeah, so gold spotted oak borer is actually another type of wood-boring beetle. It's not an ambrosia beetle, but it can kill trees. It has been found killing oak trees in California. We are concerned about it. We're prepared for it. We were actually waiting for both of these beetles to arrive here. And so we were kind of expecting that that one will make it up here too. However, it does seem like that one is a little bit less tolerant of colder conditions than Mediterranean oak borer. So we might be safe, but as conditions change up here, species will migrate. So I think it might be a matter of time before that gets up here as well.
Okay. And then Anna says, I was under the impression that oaks should not be watered. Not so, or just not consistent watering. So
That's
about the monthly watering.
a
Yeah.
very good clarification point. Not consistent watering. Oaks don't like wet feet, so we don't want to drench them. Don't put a soaker hose around the oaks permanently, or even a sprinkler. And when I say watering, I don't mean just turn on a sprinkler for 30 minutes. Large trees especially need a long, slow, deep watering. That's why it's an overnight watering. It's a big lift, but this is not something you want to do all the time. It's a one-time watering once a month that will not harm the oaks. However, one more caveat, and it's in that watering fact sheet that I have a link to. If you water a tree, you have to keep up with that watering. So you can't decide to water once, twice, and then you're just going to quit doing it. Because that tree has then become accustomed to a higher moisture level. So you have to commit to it if you are going to do it.
Okay, thanks. That's a good clarification. Then is it the fungus or the bark beetle that causes the most damage, leading to the demise of the tree in that ambrosia?
It's the bark beetle for the bark beetles. So specifically for the bark beetles, it's the bark beetle girdling, but that fungus kind of hastens the tree death. But the bark beetle moves pretty fast, so faster than the fungus typically. With the ambrosia beetle, it's the fungus that's causing the tree mortality. It's hard to keep them straight.
Yeah, I thought that came in when you were talking about the ambrosia beetle, but I'm not 100% sure there. Okay. So then Larry says again, I'm a master gardener in the Portland area. I've seen quite a few questions from the public concerning problems with Pacific madrone decline and death. What are common problems associated with madrones in the Willamette Valley?
So madrones are actually pretty insect and disease resistant. However, they are more predisposed to a few other diseases. And I'm actually looking right now to see if I can find the OSU has a really great fact sheet that covers the majors. And I will say even the insects they list on there really aren't a big problem in madrone. It's the foliar diseases that it's most predisposed to. I find though that a lot of madrones just aren't established well, and so they just don't live for very long in the valley. However, we do still have some older, more mature madrones that for whatever reason, they blacken and they die. And I have not seen evidence of these foliar diseases. So our pathologists who are looking at diseases, they're investigating that further. But it could just be the swing of conditions that these madrones have been exposed to as well. So I will look really quick for that fact sheet and then put it in the chat because it's a good one.
Okay. Okay, and then one last one. Will destroying, and this is the question that people always ask, will destroying a tree infected with bark beetles eradicate the bark beetle? Like now I've seen it, what do I do?
Yeah, no, it will not. Because all the bark beetles that I mentioned, they are native, widespread, they're present on the landscape. So if you don't remove this, what is stressed and attracting them to the site, they're just going to keep populating. You can't stay ahead of them. We will always have bark beetles in the landscape. There are some cases, if you move quickly and it's a small area that has infestation, you can remove those infested trees or remove those stressed trees and prevent the buildup of those bark beetles. But if you have any trees that are stressed left on your landscape, these beetles will keep populating from adjacent areas. They are everywhere and they can smell these stressed trees very readily.
Okay, well, this was just an excellent presentation, Christine. Thank you so much. I really appreciated how you started off with the beneficial insects and the role that they play. And I've heard other people talk, entomologists talk about that kind of natural thinning function when conditions are changing and you don't want a thick forest. You know, we're going out there and doing field reductions, but here these beetles are kind of doing that in a natural context as well. And now, of course, our system is a little bit topsy-turvy, so we're getting some extreme effects. But I'm really glad that people like you are watching it and helping us know how to handle and how to respond. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I do like to end with a silver lining that it's not all dying out there. That I think the more that we know and we can adapt and put healthier trees out in the landscape in the right place, we're going to be in better shape.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And thanks for the backup, Rebecca. And we'll get the recording to everyone and the PDF as well, probably sometime tomorrow.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right.